The thunder arrived like a verdict. It rolled over the plain in long, slow sheets, turning the palms into black serrations against a sky that had gone entirely angry. Rain beat the coach as if trying to wash the world clean of its dust and its secrets. Each slap against the wooden roof sounded like a hand knocking insistently at a closed door. Inside, the coach smelled of wet wool and tobacco and the faint, sweet trace of mole someone had wrapped in paper for the road. Lantern light swung, revealing faces as pale and tired as the road outside. Most passengers kept their heads down, eyes fixed on the blur of rain that streaked the windows. Two women sat near the back, one with hands calloused by 20 years of stirring pots and carrying wood, the other a small, quiet figure with a parcel wrapped in oilcloth and a photograph folded inside. Rosa watched the quiet woman with that slow, particular attention of people who have learned to read lives in the way a person folds a cloth or scratches an ear. The stranger's hands were small and steady, the knuckles freckled with the kind of work less seen, perhaps sewing, perhaps careful counting of something other than coins. When the woman, almost accidentally, turned the photograph so its face caught the lantern's glow, Rosa felt something like a bird in her chest hesitate and fall. The face in the picture, a young woman, hair pinned back, a smudge of flour on her cheek perhaps, and eyes that were sharp and steady, blue-gray in the weathered paper, but alive. They looked, in a way that stopped Rosa's breath, like two things that had been waiting to recognize each other for a long time. They looked like the face she had traced on the inside of a copper pot during long nights at the stove, like the eyes she had seen once in a ragged photograph that Don Raphael had shown her in secret, his fingers trembling when he slid it toward her across a table. Rosa smoothed her apron, felt the seam of the thumb she had split years ago pull at her skin, and told herself it was foolishness to be unmoored by a face on paper. Still, the photograph tugged a thread. Memory surfaced, the smell of wet straw, a woman humming a boneless, slow lullaby in a room that had no furniture but a wooden crate, a child's laugh swallowed by the sound of men marching far off, the way Don Raphael had once slipped her a small coin with a look that said more than the coin could buy. Outside, rain drove the coach into a puddle that threw a splash against the window like an accusation. Inside, the quiet woman nestled the photograph to her breast and closed her eyes as if praying or counting courage. Rosa found herself leaning forward, not to intrude. She had learned long ago that curiosity could be a weapon, only to see more clearly. The coach lurched. A wheel hit a rut and a passenger shouted, the voice swallowed at once by another peal of thunder. The lantern quivered and then settled, and in that brief steadiness, Rosa saw the woman's face more clearly. The eyes were familiar enough to be dangerous. They fit into a place inside Rosa that ached. "What is the name of that town?" the driver called out, voice hoarse. "Hacienda del Roble is 3 leagues from the crossroads." "Then this is my stop," the quiet woman murmured, folding the photograph into the parcel with a gentleness that treated paper like bone. She rose as the coach began to slow, and for a moment her stillness was a small, secret thing the rain could not touch. Rosa's own stomach lurched as the coach dipped and climbed. She had been traveling a long night, returning from a market trip in the provincial capital, where she had sold eggs and a stitch of embroidered napkins to buy sugar for the kitchen that had kept her through 2 decades. She had worn her best blouse, patched though it was at the elbow, and had tucked her hair into a handkerchief the way Don Raphael liked it, neat and without fuss. The thought of home made a small, steady ache in her chest. The hacienda was more than a job. It was a body of work, a place where her name had been spoken quietly in corridors, where her hands were known to the clay of the ovens and to the soft, essential rhythm of meals given and eaten. When the coach at last eased to a halt beneath the lantern by the hacienda gate, rain had loosened to a steady weep. Lantern light puddled in the ruts and threw the hacienda's dark silhouette into something like a promise. Rosa stepped down into the mud and felt the familiar give of the earth under her boots. The gate swung and closed with the same sigh it always made. Don Raphael was waiting on the veranda. He was smaller than the stories made him out to be, a man diminished by illness, bent as if from carrying too much for too long, his face mapped with the peculiar soft lines of one who has loved quietly. He smelled of camphor and lemon peel. In his hand he carried a little parcel tied with a string, and his eyes, when he saw Rosa, were clear and glad without show. "Ah, Rosa," he said, and the voice was hoarse with something like relief. "You're back." "Just in time for supper," Rosa answered, because that was the thing one said when one knew how small safety could be. She set down her own parcel, the sack of sugar and a small painted tin she had kept for herself, and let her shoulders loosen in a way that might have looked like exhaustion, but was really habit. "Drizzle and thunder," the quiet woman said then, approaching without ceremony. Up close, the photograph's owner was younger than Rosa had thought, with a pale crescent scar at the wrist and an impatient way of standing that made her look smaller than she was. When she bowed ever so slightly to Don Raphael, Rosa saw a flash of etiquette learned among strangers, of careful practice. "This is my guest," Don Raphael said, and his voice found a steadiness that was patient. "She arrived on the coach. She'll be welcome here for the night, if you have room, Rosa." Rosa's hands felt as if they had burned. Hospitality was a thing she practiced the way one polished a pan, by habit and by instinct. "Of course," she said. "There's a spare bed behind the pantry and soup in the pot. Whoever comes can eat." The quiet woman watched Rosa with those hard, careful eyes. She placed her parcel on the floor and, failing to find the exact words, offered a nod. When the others had taken their places and the lamps were set, Rosa moved like a boat she knew by memory. Her hands arranged bowls, ladles, a thin stew of beans and squash that would fill the belly without pretending to be more. She worked with a small, contained joy. The stove took to her like an old friend. There was the smell of onion and cumin, the breath of citrus, the sing of pepper. People ate, and in the eating, the house remembered that there had been a woman who made it whole. They ate, and when the dishes were cleared and the servants had been sent away with their portions, Don Raphael took Rosa aside. He placed the parcel he had carried on a low table and touched her hand with such gentle familiarity that Rosa felt the conjuring of a life she had not known how to claim. "You're tired," he said. "You did not need to make so much effort in the market." "It's work that keeps hands from wandering," Rosa replied, and the old rhythm took hold. "And the kitchen keeps its own counsel." He laughed with a smallness that suggested both gratitude and embarrassment. "You have kept this place together when I could not. You have been steady, Rosa." "I've had nothing else to be," she said. The words were not a plea, they were a statement of fact. She had been a child when she first came to the hacienda, torn from something she could not name and given a place in the kitchen. She had learned to know a family not as myth but in minutia. The way keys jangled in a pocket, the sound of shoes on the veranda, the cadence of a voice when someone was about to scold, and the way it softened afterward. "Tomorrow," Don Raphael said, and his fingers tightened on hers in a way that felt like contraband. "Tomorrow you will sleep. You will not go to the market again until I say." Rosa wanted to say, "You have always been kind," and she wanted to say, "Why do you look at me so?" Instead, she simply nodded and let the night do the rest. They slept in rooms that smelled of cedar and mothballs and the kind of quiet that made a woman list every sound the house had to offer. But the storm that had battered the coach was not done. Word had a way of traveling faster than a coach. Men could hear about a death down to the neighboring village in fewer hours than a letter would have taken. By dawn, the hacienda's courtyard was full of people in sober black, and the rumor that had crept in with them, Don Raphael had taken a turn, hung over everyone like a second sad rain. The reading of the will would bring people from the provincial capital, and with them would come the particular air of succession, formal, polite, sharpened into a sort of hunger. Don Raphael had been a man of modest claims but considerable property. His name carried weight in the valley. He had not married, and for reasons some knew and most did not, his closest confidant had been the staff who kept his house. Yet houses are like hearts. They require a named hierarchy to guide them when the head's breadth runs thin. Valentina arrived in a dust-silvered carriage with 2 trunks and a manner like a closed window. She was pretty in the quick way of youth, and more dangerous for displaying that prettiness as if it were a blade she had learned to hide. Her gown was fashionably narrow, stitched from imported wool, her gloves spotless. She spoke the way people spoke in the capital, all clipped syllables and small dismissals, and it was clear from the first moment that she had measured the hacienda as if in passing through it she might claim fixtures. Don Raphael was a good man, she said, when the household had gathered and the priest had murmured a benediction. But a house is a thing that must have someone to keep it. I am his niece. It is only natural that the estate should pass to me. There were polite murmurings, and some hands that had known Don Raphael's body for years tightened around each other. Esteban, the foreman, stood with his jaw like a drawn rope. He was a man who wore his loyalty plainly, calloused hands, boots that had seen every field of the estate. He had always treated Rosa with the kind of quiet respect usually reserved for kin, and his eyes on Valentina were something like a shield. "It is as the will states," Licenciado Fuentes intoned then, in a voice learned from many such readings. He was a man of the law, small, respectable, with the firm, indifferent air of someone who had been entrusted with secrets and learned to carry them as though they were parcels too valuable to open without cause. Don Raphael left instructions to be read in full. The reading was a document of small formalities. There were legacies to the parish, to the schoolmaster, to Don Raphael's distant cousins. There were small tokens set aside for servants, 2 coins here, a parcel there, a promise of bread for the women in the kitchen on certain holy days. For most, these were gestures of a patron who had not been lavish, but who had known to mark those who had marked his life. But when, through the legal language, the notary read an instruction set aside in a sealed envelope, the room settled as if it had been struck. This sealed packet, Fuentes said, is to be opened in the event of certain circumstances. He paused, the stick of his finger on the edge of the envelope as if touching a hot coal. The instructions therein are to be followed under the law and cannot be revealed except by me. Valentina smiled with the calculation of one used to winning what she wanted without undue fuss. "We will unveil it when the time is proper," she declared. "We shall proceed with the inventories and the practical arrangements." It was practical that so many things in life hide behind such words. People called them the necessities of administration because saying, "we will decide who keeps what," sounded cruder and had the terrible power of making everyone take sides. Now, Rosa had, over the years, learned how to fold herself into such proceedings. She had been taught to bow when asked, to speak plainly when spoken to hide certain kinds of hunger behind a practiced smile. But there had been a small thread of hope that braided itself with the daily work. The idea that Don Raphael had not been indifferent to the women who had kept him fed and warm and watched over the place when the world beyond it had rasped. The sealed envelope, none of them knew what it might contain, was a small lamp in the dark. That lamp flickered into a hungry flame when, a day after the reading, a trinket was found missing. It was not a jewel for the estate. It was instead an old filigree locket with an embossed rose, the sort of thing Don Raphael had kept tucked in his drawer to look at on lonely evenings. Valentina had been wearing it the day of the funeral, and 2 nights after, when she went to bed, it had been gone. The house hummed with the discovery. People talk of missing things as if the thing were the thief. The locket had not been content to be lost, it seemed. It had been violated. Valentina's temper, usually a controlled and subtle frost, cracked into something sharp. "Who among you has handled my things?" she demanded. And the question was not only of the locket, but of power, of who could move through rooms and drawers and private boxes without the permission that wealth gives. There was a search. Rosa felt Esteban's hand on the small of her back, a gesture of something like protection or warning. Lupita, a maid whose face always suggested a smile held back for better weather, flitted like a hummingbird through rooms, opening chests and counting garments. It is one thing to be searched by law, another to be searched by wrath. The difference sits in the mouth like bile. They came to Rosa's pantry, the little space she kept half her life in, dried chiles, sacks of maize, a tin with spools of thread. They found beneath a false board where Rosa kept a few coins she had saved for a trip, the locket. It glinted in the lantern light like something unfaithful. Valentina seized it as if the object were already rendered. "She took it," Valentina said, and the single word was a blade. "Give it to me, Rosa. Why did you take my locket?" Rosa's heart made a noise she had never heard before, a single bright shock. "I did not," she said. The words were pulled out like a tooth. "I have never—" "Search everywhere," Valentina insisted, "and call the parish. This is theft. To be accused by the well-to-do is to be marked by the community." A storm of faces gathered, some hungry for scandal, some with the small horror of watching a woman they had known for a lifetime shrunk in size before them. Don Raphael's portrait on the wall watched with the indifferent eyes of a man now dead. Esteban's jaw tightened until it looked as if the countenance itself was an effort of iron. "They found it under her board," Valentina repeated. Her voice had the cold geometry of someone who had prepared for this possibility. Only later would people whisper that she had been seen near Rosa's pantry the evening before, fingers light as if testing the air. But for now, the locket rested in her palm, and the fact of its discovery made a story that few had wanted to believe feel absolutely true. Rosa knelt as if to pick up a child, and there was a moment where someone, Esteban perhaps, reached to place a hand on her shoulder. The pressure was not enough to keep the world from tilting. "This is nonsense," Rosa said, but her voice shook in a way that betrayed what frustration felt like when it congealed into shame. "Do you think?" Valentina cut her off with a look that said decisively, without cruelty, "Yes, I think." She moved with that particular speed of someone who intends to drive a nail home. "I will not have thieves under my roof." "She is the cook," Lupita blurted, as if to defend them all. "She keeps the kitchen clean. She has children." "Enough," Valentina snapped. The household, which had moments before been a collection of small loyalties, folded into the cadence of power. Accusation was the very modern tool of social expulsion. Don Raphael had been dead only a few days, and already the house took its cues from those who would inherit. They made Rosa stand in the courtyard as rain tracked down her dress. People formed an audience because a spectacle so close to home was never wasted. Licenciado Fuentes made a polite pretense of mediation. He used the words investigation and evidence and duty, while those standing nearest felt something else, the taste of a verdict, swift, social, unforgiving. "Search her trunk," Valentina ordered. "If she hides what she stole." They opened Rosa's trunk. She had nothing in it, save for her patched shirts, a moth-eaten shawl, and the few coins she kept. And there, beneath the lining someone had lifted, lay, as if laid by an unkind hand, another item. A small key with a ribbon tied through it. It was not the locket, but in the labyrinth of small things and accusations, it would serve. "You see," Valentina said, with the triumph of a woman who had been taught to recognize opportunity. She kept things hidden. She knew where boxes were kept. Rosa felt the cold of a life she had never wanted to step into. "I do not know anything of thievery," she protested. "I have nothing." "Enough," the voice of a neighbor called. "We cannot keep traitors here." There was a quick, cruel decision. Without waiting for proper inquiry, Valentina declared that Rosa must leave. The house she had tended for 20 years, whose ovens had been warmed by her hands, whose quiet nights had been knit with the rhythm of her labors, became an awkward, usurped body that had the right to eject what it found inconvenient. They did not seize her by force. There was a terrifying civility in the way a people who have internalized hierarchies can arrange a life to expel someone without seeming to be brutal. They gave her a midday to gather herself for her convenience, and then sent her away with patches wrapped into a coin purse. Rosa moved through the rooms she had known by touch. She ran a hand along the shelf where she kept the copper pan she had used when Don Raphael used to ask for something sweet. She paused before the sleeping room she had been allotted for years, a place that smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon. If the house had once been a body that she belonged to, it now conjured the sense of being a stranger inside a chest that no longer wanted her existence to be steeped in its air. "Take her away," Valentina said with cold finality. "Let her find her own way." Esteban tried to speak. His words came out tangled, as if the cord that held his loyalty had been wet and knotted. "This is wrong," he said softly, as if the words themselves might die in the air. "Rosa has been—" "You cannot dispute the word of the lady who holds the estate," Licenciado Fuentes answered with the tone of impartiality that cuts like ice. "There will be formal proceedings if someone wishes to bring a complaint, but the house must be kept in order." So Rosa left. She walked out into the rain that had not yet forgiven the night. She carried a small bundle of things: the tin with her last coins, a handkerchief, and the old photograph she had kept tucked in her apron, the one Don Raphael had shown her years ago, and which had since become a private talisman. The world shrank to the sound of her boots in the road and the small, thrumming pulse of indignity. The coach for the market town had left. The road to the barracks was a river of dark water. Rosa walked with no destination other than a small hope of shelter, and with every step, the humiliation knitted itself into memory. People had cried out in the courtyard. Some had avoided looking at her. Lupita had given her a bowl of stew, as if it were contraband and a sunless apology in one. She reached the crossroads by dusk, the sky a slate the color of old iron. The town was a scattering of lanterns and shop fronts with shutters. Rosa ducked into an alcove beneath a portal and drew her shawl tight. The rain moved in endless threads and washed her face with a painful tenderness. Then, from the lane, footsteps approached. Rosa's heart flipped with a paranoia that had the bitter taste of hunger. Whoever came would bring news or mockery or the indifferent bustle of life to which she now felt she did not belong. The quiet woman from the coach appeared in the lantern light, hair damp and eyes like the photograph. She carried her parcel again, hugged to her chest as if it were a small child. "You," Rosa began. The words sat on the edge of recognition. "You were on the coach." The woman looked at her, and for a moment the rain made a silver veil between them. "You are Rosa," she said, and her voice was not a question. It was a naming with the weight of someone who had been rehearsing lines. Rosa's laugh was a small, sudden thing. "Everybody calls me that." "I thought so," the woman said, and then she held out the photograph. "You knew that face, didn't you? I saw you in the coach, and I thought, maybe—" It is difficult to explain the sudden rush of things that might be called hope. It is a small, fragile animal that comes with hunger and with danger. Rosa took the photograph as if touching some heat. Her fingers trembled because fear and delight had braided themselves. "Do you know who she is?" Rosa asked, moving closer despite the rain. The woman's eyes found Rosa's, and in them was a contained, enormous weariness. "I don't know her name," she said, "but I have this." She unwrapped her parcel carefully and revealed a small locket, its chain tarnished, the rose on its face softened by time. She set it in Rosa's palm with the gentleness of someone laying down a truth. Rosa looked at the locket and then to the photograph. The coincidence, or fate, if one wished to name it so, pressed against her with insistence. That the object of Valentina's accusation would cross in some other hand with a woman who carried the same face as the photograph felt like a hinge that might, by turning, open a new room. But the night had other ideas. In the town, in the dim office where Licenciado Fuentes sat and drank coffee as if he could settle the rest of the world with a cup, there came a knock. The notary's door opened on a man who had run from the hacienda, rain-slicked and breathless. He carried with him a sealed packet and the kind of news that travels with the exactness of a stone thrown into still water. There had been a theft, an expulsion, and now perhaps a witness. Fuentes held the sealed packet in his hands with the same reverence he reserved for legal things. He had scriptures in his desk and the habit of keeping a sealed thing untouched until the conditions were met. The envelope bore Don Rafael's seal. The wax was hard and unyielding, but he could not open such a thing on rumor alone. There were rules, rituals that governed the opening of sealed instructions, and Fuentes respected them the way a priest respects an altar. He listened to the man from the hacienda, then to a servant who had come with news of the town's stranger. The notary's face remained polite and inscrutable. "These matters require evidence," he said. "And due process. If a complaint is lodged, if a formal accusation is filed, then I will open the packet if the conditions are met." Outside, the rain tapered into the kind of soft that left the earth smelling clean. Rosa sat on a low step and watched the lantern swing as the town went about its small business. The quiet woman stood before her with that photograph in her hand, her face resolved and, for the first time since they'd met, open. "I have nothing here but this," the woman said, and she tucked the locket back into her parcel. "But I can travel to the notary with you. They will listen to me." Rosa's throat tightened. The world had been reduced to the possibility that a stranger might be a key. "Why would you help me?" The woman's laugh was brief. "Because poverty makes us look, and lucky names make us act," she said. "Because I have questions, and you have been wronged. Because there is nothing else to do on a night like this but find where footsteps cross." Rosa rose. She had nowhere to go but forward. Together, they walked toward the notary's modest office, their boots sucking at the road, the town folding around them like an audience. Behind them, the hacienda's courtyard was a place where gossip coiled like smoke. Inside the house, Valentina slept, satisfied for the moment, convinced she had set things right. The notary's lamp threw their shadows long and thin against the door as they entered. Fuentes looked up, eyes bright with that particular curiosity reserved for legal tangles. He listened to the story word by careful word. The stranger described the photograph, the locket, the way the coach had run through thunder, and how she had, on a whim, recognized the face and decided to follow the small ache of it. "A sealed packet remains," the stranger said, and her voice was steadier now. "Don Raphael left things to be opened under conditions. I was told by an old woman in the coach's inn that certain things would be revealed if those conditions were met. Perhaps a name, perhaps property, perhaps not. I carry this because I thought it might belong to someone." Fuentes placed his hand on the desk and his fingers steepled. The law, he knew, cared for paper the way a mother cares for a child. It protected it until the right time, but it did not ask whether the timing was cruel. If a formal complaint is made regarding theft, the authorities can take testimony, he said. If there is an instrument left by the late Don Raphael, I am constrained to follow his instructions. But you must know the law is not a spectacle. Rosa stood there with the locket in her hand, the metal cool against her palm. Her life had shifted from a rhythm of fire and preparation to a pose of accusation. She felt small and very visible, like a person who had been dressed in a costume not of their making and then led into a room full of strangers. "Will you be my witness?" Rosa asked the quiet woman. The question was as simple and dangerous as opening a shutter to a wind that might carry her whole house away. The woman's eyes softened, and in them there was the first real warmth Rosa had seen. "I will tell the truth as I know it," she answered, "and if there is more to be done after that, we will do it. But first, tell me what Don Raphael meant to you." Rosa's answer was a long, slow thing, like the way one stokes a dying flame back to life. She told of mornings before light, of hands that taught her to peel the skin from a pumpkin and to listen to a pot when it told you it was done. She told of how, once, Don Raphael had slipped her an extra loaf of bread, and how, in the face of his death, it felt as if a small world had been cut loose. Fuentes listened with the professional interest of one who sees patterns in testimony. He took down names and times and made notes with a careful hand. Still, he would not break the seal by rumor. He would not open a packet because the heart wished it. The law, for all its cold, had its own dignity. Outside, rain took to the earth like a long apology. Rosa and the woman stepped from the notary's office into air that felt both thinner and more crowded. People had rumors, and rumors traveled faster than law. The two women walked together through streets that smelled of baked bread and wet animals, and with each step they were being watched by eyes that might offer compassion or a knife. At the corner of a street, a man with a cap tipped low on his brow, Esteban, stood with arms folded. His face, once tight with anger, had softened into something like determination. "You shouldn't have to walk the road alone," he said to Rosa, and the simplicity of the sentence held the weight of a man choosing a side. Rosa felt the world close around her like a fist, and for a moment she thought she would not be able to breathe. But then the quiet woman's hand slipped into hers, small and surprisingly warm, and that touch was an offer bigger than any speech. She was a stranger, yes, and the world had a way of letting strangers be both knife and balm. Tonight, the woman had chosen to be balm. They made their way to an inn where Rosa took a room by the hour. It smelled of stale ale, but also of people who had nowhere else to be. The parcel was set on a table, and the photograph placed beside it, as if these things were scared of being alone. Rosa sat and listened to the town breathing. She thought of the kitchen she had left, the stove cooling, the pans unpolished. She thought of Don Raphael's small kindnesses and Valentina's coldness, and she felt the shock of being unmoored. The rain, which had been a hammer, softened to a sob. She pressed the locket to her chest until its cool surface warmed. "Tomorrow," the quiet woman said softly, "they will come with the law. If they will listen, there is a way for the truth to be told." "And if they do not?" Rosa asked, because by now she knew the country had corners where justice arrived late, if at all. The woman looked at her and for the first time allowed a flicker of something else. Impatience, yes, but also a fear small enough to be honest. Then we must make the law listen, she said, not by force, by filing complaints, by gathering witnesses, by making the notary see that this is not a mere trinket fight. Rosa's hands trembled. She had never before thought in such abstract terms as filing and witness. Her life had been governed by ovens and timing and the deep certainty that if bread was not turned, something else would burn. But the idea that a world could be negotiated on paper was both terrifying and hopeful. Outside, the night was a blanket nothing could pierce. Rosa slept with the locket under her pillow and the photograph folded into the hem of her shirt. In her dreams, she saw two women at a window, one older and small and steady, the other young and impatient, both turned toward a light that had been kept from them. Dawn came with a brittle cold. The town's market began to murmur. Men with carts passed down the lane, and a priest walked by with a parcel of bread and a sermon on charity in his pocket. Rosa stepped out into the world and felt its eyes on her again. The notary's office was the first building to receive them that brittle morning, its narrow window panes still freckled with last night's rain. Fuentes had already opened the shutters when their shadows fell across the threshold. He rose as if by habit, smoothing his cuffs with a mechanical politeness. Behind him, the room smelled of ink and stale tobacco and paper kept too long under a lamp. A ledger lay open on the desk, its pages full of names like small, careful footprints. Rosa felt the weight of each step toward that table, as if walking over a bridge she could not see. Esteban walked at her elbow, his hand near the butt of a stick, more from habit than threat. Lupita trailing with small, practical gestures, her cupped hands filled with a cloth of bread. The quiet woman, Mariana, moved with a steadiness earned by other kinds of nights. She kept the photograph folded in one pocket and the locket wrapped again, as though its chain might still remember less violent hands. Licenciado Fuentes listened without the dramatic inclinations of a tavern storyteller. He made notes, asked the precise questions the law required. Who had seen the object last? Where it had been? Who could attest to the arrival of the stranger on the coach? He folded his hands like someone who could fold a problem into an envelope. When Rosa told him how the locket had been found under her pantry board and how Valentina had declared her a thief, he did not look shocked. Fuentes had seen such claims more than once, but his mouth tightened. "You must make a formal declaration," he said. "A verbal accusation has weight only when it is placed before the proper record. If you wish the law to intervene, you must sign a petition. I will record it and receive testimony." Rosa had never before considered the law as an instrument that could be used for herself. Her world had been of spoons and embers and the small certainties of fire. The idea of paper doing justice was foreign and a little terrifying. But Mariana's hand on hers was warm and resolute. "We will file it," the young woman said. "We will give our testimony. We will ask him to open the envelope." A hush stretched between the pages of Fuentes's ledger when he looked at the seal on the packet that had lain untouched during the reading of the will. Don Raphael's wax was an impression of a tree, an oak, pressed into red wax, neat and certain. He stood then, retrieving the leather-bound bundle that contained the will's codicil. His fingers trembled only slightly. There are moments when a man's profession aligns with what his bones know to be right, and for Fuentes this was one of them. He understood that a packet placed under certain conditions was not a riddle to be left unsolved when those conditions might now be met. "You understand," he said to the small gathering, "that the envelope was to be opened only in the circumstances described by the deceased. Mr. Fuentes's instructions were precise. I will not act upon rumor, but if a claim is made that bears upon lineage and you assert such a claim, then the law provides a way to proceed. Rosa watched his mouth make the syllables claim and lineage like two stones being set in place. The word lineage was cold, like a coin passed from an unfamiliar hand. Yet it was also a word with a hinge that might open the door she had been pushed from. They took their statements one by one. Esteban, uncomfortable in language finer than a plow's grip, spoke plainly of what he had seen in the kitchen. Don Rafael's habit of slipping coins to certain faces, his tendency to pause and look at servant children with something like pity owned by no one else. Lupita spoke with the sort of detail only those who keep households can. The little loaf kept for that child on market days, the way Don Rafael had once set aside a scrap of velvet for a hem a cook had shown him. Padre Miguel, when he was fetched, remembered a baptism in the outskirts where a child had been blessed by a name not known among townsfolk. He had once received a small, furtive donation from Don Rafael in exchange for keeping silence about a visit. These were not legal proofs alone, but they were the fraying ends of a thread that might be traced to its spool. Mariana sat quietly until Fuentes spoke her name. When she rose, she handed over the photograph and the locket, the artifacts that had moved her to follow a face across a storm. She told the story of a house on the road where a woman had died giving a child, how a seamstress had taken the infant, and told the traveler to keep watch for a man with an oak seal who would sometimes visit and leave coins and silent gifts. It all sounded, in the dry air of the notary's office, like the sort of tale that could be dismissed as the blur of grief and the mind's eagerness for stories. But the photograph had a face, and the locket had a rose. Small things have small insistences. A photograph will not speak a lie with its silvered eye, and a locket will not pretend to be what it is not. Fuentes cleared his throat. Under these circumstances, I will read Don Rafael's sealed instructions, he said. But the law demands witnesses. Those present who will attest to this declaration must sign. The room held its breath in a way the sea might hold a wave back. A man standing outside the door, an usher from the hacienda who had bolted to the town at the first rumor, came in with a face like wet bark. He confirmed that he had seen Don Rafael visit the outskirts home, though always in the shadow, and that he had once carried parcels to the seamstress for reasons too private for speech. The ledger took names and signatures, and the pen scraped like a cockroach's leg against paper. When Fuentes broke the wax, he did so with the same solemnity as one breaking a bread. The seal snapped with a sound that seemed louder than the room warranted. He opened the envelope and withdrew a packet sealed with another ribbon. Inside were papers folded the way those who lived by secrecy fold their truths. A letter in Don Rafael's hand, a baptismal certificate bearing the parish stamp, and a codicil formally adding instructions to his will. The letter's edges had yellowed. Don Rafael's handwriting was careful, his letters slow and considerate. Rosa listened as Fuentes read aloud, his voice moving from legal cadence to something more human as the content turned private and direct. My dear Fuentes, Don Rafael had written, there are truths a man carries like embers in his pocket, afraid to burn those nearest to him. If this reaches you, know that I have feared neither your eyes nor your oath. I have had that which is not common knowledge. I have fathered a child. No, two. One remained with me. One was given into care to protect her from the storms men make. If at my death these matters are contested by those who would claim sole guardianship to the exclusion of the other, I ask that you open this and act for justice so that the dignity owed to both be returned. I entrust this to you because you know the law and because you have kept silence when silence was mercy. Both daughters, Rosa of the kitchen and the child named Mariana by the woman who kept her, are my blood. Give to both what is just. If I cannot bring them together in life, let this be the place for reconciliation in my death." The codicil that followed was precise. Don Raphael formally acknowledged the names of 2 women as his daughters, described the giving of a locket and photograph as marks of his affection, and assigned a portion of the estate's income to each. It named, in an addendum, certain goods and the house's stewardship to be negotiated not by a single heir, but by those who had shared his life, by those who have long kept my household, and those born of my blood. When Fuentes finished reading, the room felt as if a crest had broken. Valentina, who had been absent from the morning's walk into town, had heard through the whispered channels that rumor leaves like a trail. She arrived breathless, her gloves dampened by the wet air, her face a contrast of composed anger and bewilderment. For a moment, she stood at the doorway like a woman finding her world shift under her feet. "This is a forgery," she said aloud before the accusation could be contained. "The handwriting is not." "It bears Don Raphael's seal," Fuentes answered evenly, "and Padre Miguel can confirm the baptismal certificate. These are registered instruments." Valentina's composure broke then into shards. My aunt raised me and told me he was my guardian, and there is not a word of this in what she told me. I was promised that this house would be mine, and I will not have it stolen by—" She stopped, her breath catching on how the word stolen would sound if she could not make it stick. The notary looked to Rosa and then to Mariana. "The law must speak with facts," he said. "You have testimony and instruments. The codicil makes explicit the deceased's desire. Valentina, you may contest these findings, but one cannot reconstruct the past by empty words. If you believe these documents are false, you must prove it." Valentina's face flushed with the color of rage. She could not yet find argument where the evidence stood. Instead, she sought to shift the field. "Then let us see the receipts. Where is proof that these children were recognized in life? Where is the money he sent? Where are the witnesses who saw him visit the seamstress?" A corner of Esteban's mouth lifted. "I saw him go to the outskirts myself," he said. "I carried a parcel once. I did what he asked. I would not lie for a maid if it saved my own skin." The parish registers were called. Padre Miguel rose, and, with hands that trembled in part from age and in part from the knowledge of how fragile redemption can be, he described a baptismal entry. The ink had faded, but the stamp of the church remained. It was, as Fuentes had said, a legal paper, a birth recorded under a priest's hand with the parish seal. That was enough, within the measure of law, to produce consequences. Fuentes read the codicil aloud again, his voice a steady bell. It named Rosa and Mariana as beneficiaries. It directed that property and the house's sustenance be apportioned, and that the locket, described in a clause with an almost absurd specificity, be returned to the woman who had been nourished by Don Raphael's kindness. For a few minutes, the world simply held its breath. Then a murmur rose, not entirely unkind, from those who had known Don Raphael. There is a human tendency to want the dead to remain as they were, neat, uncomplicated, and this new knowledge disturbed that neatness. But law has a way of cleaving neatness. It sets a blunt edge to that which had been rounded by habit. Valentina retreated into a corner of fury and confusion. She had expected to inherit with the smoothness of a procession. Instead, she faced a reality that required her to share and to repent. Her motives, when forced into articulation later that day in a harsher room where apologies and accusations collide, were not rooted in pure malice, but in fear and in the education of scarcity. She had been taught to see the world as a series of possessions to secure. When the locket vanished, she made a choice to wield accusation as a tool. It is the sort of decision made in panic. It feels today like cruelty, but often begins as self-preservation. Still, an accusation had been made. A woman had been expelled, a life torn from a hearth. The law could return papers and reassign shares, but it could not simply reknit a human heart. That peace would require the subtler work of confession and forgiveness, and if any of them wanted it, the day would have to be heavy with truth. Rosa returned to the hacienda that afternoon, not as a servant called back, but as a person summoned by the wind of official papers. The courtyard smelled of wood smoke and the faint copper twang of cutlery. Some of those she had known for years looked at her as though sizing up the person she had become under pressure, some with tenderness and some with scandalized distance. Lupita wept openly when she saw Rosa, crossing the yard to take her hands. Esteban stood tall and quiet, an anchor who clearly imagined himself between any further violence and the woman he had watched knead dough for a lifetime. When Rosa crossed the threshold of the kitchen, it was as if the room recognized her by muscle memory. Her hands knew the space as a second skin. They reached for a ladle and, without thinking, measured broth as if to prove she had not lost the art. The hearth took to her touch like a friend. Workers returned to the rhythm of a woman with the authority of craft, and yet the air had changed. The servants were not returning to the same balance of things. Now there would be other voices claiming authority. The house itself had been divided in more than paper. Valentina appeared soon after, her gloves removed and her face made of brittle lines. She had requested a private audience with Rosa. It was a messy, human thing, not scheduled by lawyers, but summoned by the ache of what she had done. They met where the house's plaster kept warmth, the small salon that had once held Don Rafael's pipe and his chair. The light fell on a portrait of the man, and the painting's eyes seemed oddly unconcerned with the drama below. "You did not have to make me a monster," Valentina said, and in the confession was the first bend of something like contrition. "I thought if I used the right argument, the right force, I could keep what my aunt promised me. I was terrified of losing it. I saw you as an obstacle." Rosa listened, the way a woman listens who has been schooled in the habits of humility. Not because she would accept the charge of being heir without protest, but because she understood what hunger did to a heart. "You made me leave," she said. "You named me a thief." Valentina's voice cracked. "I know," she answered, and the word felt like a stone hitting water. "I thought you were less because that is what my life taught me to think. I am sorry. It is a poor apology for what I took from you." Rosa thought of how the house had thrown her out with a kind of quiet courtesy. She thought of the nights on the road, the sting of humiliation, and the way an accusation could rearrange a life. Her hands, calloused and sure, twitched with the memory of their work. Forgiveness was not a thing she could give lightly, nor did she want to erase the truth of what had been done. But she also recognized the usefulness of a face that could be turned away from vengeance toward rebuilding. "You can speak the truth in front of them," she said finally. "You can tell them what you told me here. That is what matters now. I do not want you punished beyond what is fair. But there are things that must be returned." Valentina's shoulders hunched, as if the confession had cost her breath. "I will tell them," she said, and the muscles around her jaw set with an ugly determination, part compulsion, part relief. "I will say it, and I will beg for forgiveness." Valentina told the household. Her voice was not theatrical. It was small and human, which made the thing more tolerable. She spoke of jealousy and of the fear that had taught her to believe that to keep one meant to ruin another. She named the seamstress and the moment when she had found the locket and placed it in Rosa's pantry, and the cold triumph that had followed that action. There was no dramatic collapse, those are reserved for novels, but there was an honest unraveling, the likes of which people rarely witness. A private edifice of fear giving way. The household reacted in predictable mixtures. Some met the confession with pity, others with a distaste that kept their distance. Yet the truth settled like a new layer of dust. It needed to be wiped clean with the same hands that had once been shoved away. The notary arranged a public reading of the codicil for all present in the hacienda on a day when the weather had ceased its violent moods and the sky hung clear, thin as glass. People arrived not simply because gossip had promised spectacle, but because practical arrangements had to be made, accounts to be balanced, servants to be assigned, and the house's fate to be decided. Fuentes read with the legal decorum that made pages heavier. The codicil named Rosa and Mariana as heirs. It spelled out the income to be shared. It appointed a small council, Esteban, Lupita, Padre Miguel, and Licenciado Fuentes himself, to oversee the transition until a formal arrangement could be codified. It was during this reading that Mariana stood and spoke in a voice that had lived through nights of silence. "I am Mariana," she said, "and I am Rosa's sister. I was given away to protect me. I have come to find what was mine." She detailed in bare strokes the life she had had. A seamstress's house where she learned to stitch by lamplight, a river of small kindnesses that sustained one child's days. She had grown into a woman, small in the shoulders but wide in the eyes. She told them of the photograph she carried, how it had been taken in a kitchen of flour and posture, how Don Rafael had once looked at that photograph with a strange affection. Rosa heard each word and felt them fit like fragments of a vessel she had always suspected existed but could not name. The locket in her hand grew warm as a thing that had returned to the palm of its original owner. The notary confirmed through the baptismal certificate that Mariana's name corresponded to the record. Padre Miguel affirmed the entry in his parchment. It was official. It was, in the blunt geometry of paper and ink, true. The reunion was not a single held breath and an embrace filmed like a painted plate. It was messy, a collision of years of absence and the mutual recognition of small details. The way each tilted her head when remembering a lullaby, the same nick on the left thumb Rosa had from childhood, the tiny scar crescent on Mariana's wrist that matched an old seam in a photograph. They wept in fits and starts, their hands searching each other's faces for proof and for permission to belong. Esteban stood to one side as if he had always been waiting for this moment to justify his faith in the woman he had defended. Word travels briskly in a household. The servants, some with tears and some with curious distance, crowded near the doorway and watched as the two women found each other within a swirl of paperwork and murmured apologies. Valentina, awed into humility, stepped forward with a small box of coins and a formal apology offered not as a dramatic flourish, but as a practical attempt at restitution. The event had not erased her misdeed, but it had allowed for a beginning of repair. From the legal perspective, the arrangement Fuentes prescribed was reasonable and temperate. He assigned a modest portion of the estate's income to Rosa for life support and more for Mariana, explaining that the law must balance generosity with caution. He established a council to manage the hacienda's accounts until a formal transfer could be codified at the next sitting of the courts in the provincial capital. The work of repairing what had been broken, however, would be less a matter of contracts than of the daily small things, returning to the kitchen with authority rather than fear, gaining the quiet recognition of those who had turned their faces away in the morning of accusation. When the formalities concluded and the crowd dispersed, the two sisters found themselves alone by the hearth. The kitchen smelled of broth and wood smoke and the small iron tang of coins. Rosa had set a pot on the stove without thinking. The action was her instinct and a show of what she intended to keep. Some things cannot be handed over. They live in the hands that know them. "You could have come sooner," Rosa said, not as accusation, but as the observation of a woman who had waited long. Mariana's hands folded in her lap. I was afraid, she admitted, and I did not know where to start. The world I left was a series of small, secret places. I thought if I followed a face and a token, I might find what I sought. I did not imagine I would find such a storm already at the house. Rosa laughed, a quick sound that broke the room into smaller pieces. Storms are very good at finding their own weather. They shared a cup of thin coffee and spoke quietly of the years, the lullaby each remembered in fragments, the odd comfort of a hand that once smoothed a brow. They compared scars and nicknames and a memory of a woman humming as she kneaded dough. It was not long before the talk turned to practicalities, how to feed the workers, how to divide responsibilities, whether the old orchard should be tended or sold. The sisterhood that had been formed in the margins of a man's life now had to bear the weight of administration. Rosa surprised herself by the steadiness of her choices. She refused immediately to claim extravagant revenge. What I want, she told Mariana, is a place to live and the right to keep working. I do not need the title to make the kitchen whole, but I want the dignity that people will no longer call me by a name that makes me small. Mariana, with the intensity of one who had lived hidden, agreed. We shall ask for fairness, she said. We shall honor the documents, and we shall decide together how to run the house. They proposed a plan to Fuentes and the council. Rosa would be reinstated as head of the kitchen with an official stipend and a small room in the main house. Mariana, having some practical skill with needlework and accounts, would be entrusted with certain records and with the oversight of the women's quarters. Esteban was asked to remain as foreman to mediate between daily labor and the plan. Valentina was offered a role that allowed for dignity while curbing the impulse to claim absolute dominion. She would remain part of the household, but would no longer be its sole steward. The plan carried with it the smell of pragmatism and the sound of good sense. Better to weave a new fabric than to tear the old into rags and fight over the scraps. Public opinion was fickle, but contracts and visible acts of restitution tend to weigh heavier with time than the gossip that accompanies them. Fuentes wrote, the council signed, and the house settled into a new geometry of authority. There was one final, quieter step that Rosa insisted upon. She asked Valentina to stand before the staff and declare, with her own voice, what she had done and to ask for forgiveness. It was humiliating, and it was necessary. Valentina trembled under the weight of that request. She had always protected herself behind polite words and well-timed influence. Now she had to speak with the force of her own shame. The apology was not theatrical. It was a halting admission. I blamed you, Rosa, because I was afraid, Valentina said. I thought my future demanded that I cut others out of the world. I was wrong. I ask your forgiveness. The servants listened. Some cried, others merely nodded, with the small grace of those who had lost more than one thing in their lifetimes. Many were practical. They wanted their wages regularized. They wanted fair treatment. They wanted the fear of arbitrary accusation to end. The formal apology, combined with the legal settlement, brought a sense of closure that was not transcendent, but was, in the concrete way of human communities, what people needed to sleep at night. That evening, when the lamps were lit and the house exhaled the day's heat, Rosa stood at the stove and cooked a modest meal. She made a pot of stewed beans with a bright streak of citrus peel, the sort of food that mends hunger and spirits without the need for ceremony. She ladled bowls with the sure motion of a woman who had practiced generosity as a craft. Workers and servants came and ate together in a way that felt new. Valentina sat somewhat apart, small and pensive, while Mariana moved through the room with an ease that claimed her belonging by the simplest of gestures, pouring water for the workers, placing a small rag across the table to blot spills, tying back a loose lock of hair for a young girl. Esteban watched, a man who understood the ways of labor and the fragile architecture of trust. He did not speak of debts or of glory. He simply kept the gate in view and the fields in his mind, the kind of man for whom justice is measured in the fairness of plowshare lines. Padre Miguel blessed the food with a short prayer, performed not with dogma, but with a sense of gratitude that the household had not been sundered beyond repair. In the days that followed, paperwork moved slowly to the capital, signatures were collected and formalized, and the estate's accounts were apportioned as Fuentes had written. People came occasionally to see what such changes meant for them. Laborers wanting clarity about their rents and wages, neighbors gossiping about the new arrangement. The past did not vanish. Rosa's humiliation remained a scar, and there were visitors who would glance at her with old eyes. But there was also a nascent respect, a sense that this woman who had been pushed out in the rain had returned with legal proof at her side and the authority of her own hands behind her. Mariana proved to be more than the photograph she had carried. She had the nimble fingers of a seamstress and a sharp mind for accounts. She was also quick to laugh at things Rosa had found too heavy to smile at. She and Rosa discovered small pleasures in shared work, arranging the pantry in a way that made sense, teaching a young apprentice to roll dough, comparing the best firewood for long winter nights. They became, in small ways, the household center, not a pompous throne, but a steady hearth that others could approach. The relationship with Valentina remained complicated. Her confession had opened a door, but Rosa kept her boundaries. Forgiveness, she understood now, was not a ceremonial erasure, but a daily practice of choosing not to hold a grudge while also guarding against the possibility of further harm. She allowed Valentina to remain in the house, but insisted that those who had been wronged not be made to serve the one who wounded them. Valentina, humbled, agreed to the terms with a dignity that cost her dearly and that she had to rebuild with practical acts of contrition, taking on charitable work for the poor in the nearby town, public aid to the seamstress's widow whom she had once slighted. One late afternoon, after the formalities had quieted and the heat of change had cooled into routine, Rosa walked out into the orchard with Mariana. The light lay across the trees like a promise folded into gold. Workers in the fields hummed, the rhythm of scythes steady as a heartbeat. The storm that had once seemed a verdict now felt, from this distance, like a night that had washed the ground clean enough to allow something fragile to grow. They found an old bench beneath the largest oak, the very emblem pressed into Don Rafael's seal, and sat side by side. For a long while they said nothing, content with the kind of silence that was not emptiness, but the shared knowledge of being two people who had found a way to belong to one another. "What will you do now?" Mariana asked finally, breaking a silence that was comfortable as an old shawl. Rosa looked at the horizon, where field met sky, the same place she had once traced with the view from the kitchen window. "I will keep this kitchen," she said. "I will teach others to cook well. I will make sure the bread is fair and the soups are warm. I will not let hunger be a thing to make monsters of us." Mariana smiled, and the expression seemed to fit her face like a patch on a sore coat. "And I will mend things that tear," she said. "Not only clothes. I will stitch the house together in the places it has frayed." They clasped hands then, two palms calloused in different ways, one by the constant heat of a stove, the other by needles and thread. And the gesture had in it the weight of vows not proclaimed but kept. The orchard's wind stirred the leaves, and somewhere in the house a pot began to sing. Weeks turned to months, and the hacienda found a new rhythm. Rosa's name rejoined the household's vocabulary, not as a whisper of scandal, but as a title of competence. Mariana opened a small room where she mended garments and kept records, and Valentina took on duties to make amends. Esteban held the field steady. Lupita managed a new shift of workers and watched the younger women learn. Fuentes returned to his ledger, comforted by the law's small power to set wrongs in order. Padre Miguel visited and blessed the new agreements with short words that did not sanctify, but did offer a quiet hope. The final act that closed the visible arc of their ordeal was not dramatic. It was a modest dinner in the servants' hall, organized by Rosa and prepared with her hands and Mariana's neat touch. They invited those who had stood with them, the seamstress's widow, Esteban, Lupita, and a few children who had once watched Rosa move like a quiet miracle. Valentina, for the first time in months, sat without the posture of acclaim and participated in the serving. Her apologies had been given and accepted in the measure required by those whom she had wronged. Rosa served the stew and watched the bowls passed from hand to hand. The sound of eating is its own kind of reconciliation. The clatter of spoons, the soft murmur of conversation, the small laughter of children who do not yet know how some things cut. She thought of the night the storm had broken, of the coach that had brought a photograph and a locket into her life. She had once believed the storm had come to punish her, to close doors. Now she saw it, with the clarity of hindsight, as a force that had unrooted the house's complacency and exposed what lay beneath. Before the evening drew to a close, Rosa rose and walked to the center of the room. She did not make a speech in the dramatic way of a person seeking applause. Instead, she simply said, with the plain certainty that had carried her through 2 decades, "Thank you." Her voice was steady. "Thank you for the bread and for the hands that made it. We have a long way to go before things are fixed. But for tonight, let us eat." They ate, and the world outside the kitchen hummed with its ordinary cares. The portrait of Don Raphael still hung on the wall, and it looked upon them with the same inscrutable gaze as ever. But in the corner, near the hearth, a new small photograph rested on a shelf. 2 women, one with flower on her cheek, one with a small crescent scar, standing close, their faces lit by a lamp. A locket, cleaned and shining, lay beside it. When the last light had been put out and the house slept with the slow breathing of a thing that had passed through grief and come out the other side, Rosa lay awake for a while, thinking of storms and of the small ways a life can be altered. She envisioned the road that had carried her away in the rain and back into a house that was, finally, partly her own. The morning came with the quiet of a place ready to begin again. Rosa rose and walked to the stove. She warmed water and set a small pot for breakfast, her motions as steady and practiced as a prayer. Mariana entered the kitchen with a basket of eggs, and together they set the table for those who would come, workers in the field, children in patched clothes, the old seamstress who had once kept a secret. Outside, the last of the storm's memory clung to the leaves in the form of tiny beads of water that caught the sun. It was a reminder that some nights are needed to wash what must be seen. The world had not become anything other than what it had been, full of hunger and kindness, of cruelty and grace. But within the house a new covenant had been stitched, not a fantasy of perfect healing, but a practical arrangement of labor and love, of restitution and limits, of 2 women who had found a way to be sisters in the midst of a messy world. Rosa lifted her spoon and tasted the broth. It was plain and honest and made by hands that had known how to make warmth from little. She thought of the storm and of the quiet passenger who had become a sister, of Don Raphael's folded words that had finally been opened like a small gate, and of the slow human work of forgiveness. She placed a single ladle in the pot and turned toward the door where the workers were gathering like familiar birds. As she stepped outside, the sunlight fell warm on her back. Thunder was a memory now, the sky was clear and long. But in her mind, the sound of rain still had a taste, one she would not forget. It had been a verdict, yes, it had struck hard and cold. Yet it had also been the weather of a night that, in its fury, had pressed 2 lives together and shown them, finally, the face of the other. She opened the door and called, and the house answered her with the small noise of a place waking. The storm had passed, the work remained, but so did the hope that a life rebuilt by truth and tempered by mercy can be steady enough to last.